I got an email on New Year's Eve from a guy out in Hawaii who told me this fantastic story about software that he had written and that the developer had basically encrypted and said, I'm not going to give it to you until you pay me money. And an extortion amount, like he was saying, no, I want like a lot of money for this. So he's basically holding it ransom. And so this guy calls me and he's, oh man, I really need help. And he had found me because I'm a surfer. And he had found my website. At the time, I had a website where I was talking about all the different surf spots along the coast of Florida, which is where I grew up. And I was saying, like, here's what each one does, here's what you can find there and stuff like that. If you're a programmer writing Java, and this app he had was in Java, and you're a surfer, I'm out in Hawaii, you should come out here and see if we want to work together. I was like, okay, let's give it a shot. So I flew out there to see, and we decided, yeah, it'd be interesting to work together. And my wife amazingly said, okay, we have one chance to do this. We'll uproot our entire family, including triplets who are 3 years old, take them out to Hawaii and try to give it a chance. And we did.
I was going to wear my DNS haiku t-shirt, but then I realized you can't really see it in the frame anyway. So a lost opportunity there. How are you doing, Anthony?
I'm well, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, that saying, the friend of my enemy is my friend. No, the other way around. We spoke about DNS at SRE Day, I think with one of your people, and they were like, oh, you guys, you don't know nothing about DNS. You should talk to Anthony. And here we are.
So I've been writing software since 1994. Was there in the earliest days when the web browser was first being introduced. I remember Mosaic. I remember the first versions of Netscape. And I got involved in the domain industry in 99 during the deregulation of the .com TLD. And I was the CTO at one of the first 7 companies that was able to sell .com domains. So I've been in and out of this industry for a while. I've written a lot of software around DNS and domains and probably thrown away more than most people have written. So I know a little bit about it, and I still am learning every day. So that's an intro about me a little.
For anybody who was born after you started coding, what's the DNS.com deregulation?
So originally the .com TLD, the top level domain that is the most commonly used TLD in the world, was managed by one company, and that was Network Solutions. The US government had oversight on it. And what they said is, we want to deregulate this so that it can actually be competitive and introduce a system so other companies could sell .com domains to customers directly. And that was the deregulation that occurred in 1999. And in order to do that, they basically said, okay, Network Solutions, you're going to operate the registry, which is the database that holds all of the .com domains, but other companies will be allowed to become accredited with you and will sell .com domains directly to consumers. And the idea was create both price and functionality competition. And it worked out pretty well, considering now that there are several thousand registrars that sell TLDs all across the range, not only old ones like .com and .net, but a bunch of new TLDs, things that were introduced back in 2012, 2013, as well as country code top-level domains for all various countries around the world.
And I think you told me when we were prepping for this that you wrote a DNS server 3 times. Is it because it's the lucky number, or were you getting it wrong the previous times?
I think a lot of it was just the first time that I wrote it, it was a learning experience. And I think if I recall correctly, I wrote the first one in Perl, which is silly, but did that. And then I wrote one in Java and worked on that for a while. And then the most recent one is written in Erlang. And I think a lot of it's just the evolution of my own career, and it followed along with the languages that I was using at any given time that coincided with when I had a need. I've also found it's actually a really interesting protocol to use as a learning tool if you want to write something in a language for the first time, especially if you're not going to take it to production, but you want to see how it all works. Because it's such a well-known and easy-to-use protocol, it's just really easy to send UDP and TCP packets to a name server. There's tools out there for doing it very easily. So it's a fun way to learn a new language as well. And I've used it for that aspect also.
Was the Perl version a bet? Did you have to win that one?
No, I cut my teeth on Perl back in the days. And back in the days when we were still talking CGI and the Common Gateway Interface in order to get web browsers to be able to do things beyond just static HTML. So Perl is just the language I grew up with. I learned programming, in fact, the first time with, I think it was called How to Program in 24 Days with Perl or something like that. So that was how I learned how to write software. I'm not a professionally trained software developer.
And that's back in the day when CGI didn't mean a Marvel movie.
Yeah, exactly. At least in our space, it was only known really as the way that you talked from a web browser to some sort of server process that was going to build HTML and send it back out. This was even pre-PHP, just like the early days of PHP and things like that. And I just happened on Perl because a lot of the first stuff was written in Perl because it was written by folks that were running Unix machines and running little web services.
So I've got a confession to make. I've never actually written a DNS server, so I don't think I fully understand what it needs to be doing. My experience has been primarily in debugging it and trying to understand what I did wrong and why nothing is working, hence the haiku. And I want to go and geek out quite a lot about that because I'm very curious. I've never spoken to anybody who actually set up a registrar and all the things that need to happen so that Miko likes cookies.com can exist and people can actually go and hit that. But I also wanted to touch briefly on the bootstrapped nature of your company because that's something that's very impressive to me. And I think you mentioned that you've got a reasonably lean team and you managed to make it work in what I perceive as a quite competitive space. Would you like to tell us a little bit and also include why it's not DNSimple and it's DNSimple?
So DNSimple was started in 2010 by myself and my brother. At the time, I wrote all of the software and he did all of the initial setup of the servers because he was doing more of the sysadmin side of things and I was doing pretty much everything else. And at the time, I had just ended working on a startup where I was the CTO of another startup that kind of didn't really succeed, but it was also in the domain space. And I think if I recall correctly, I was managing some of my own domain names with another provider, and I was using their DNS interface. And I was like, why am I doing this? This is really terrible. And I said, okay, I had done I'm going to go work for a big company. I had done I'm going to work for startups. Now I said, I want to try to do something on my own. I'm going to try to do something simple and it's going to support my lifestyle. And my lifestyle is one where I value time more than money. And I want to have the flexibility to live anywhere. So during the entirety of DNSimple, I've been able to move around with my family and still operate the company. And so that was the genesis of DNSimple. At the time, I wasn't very creative coming up with names. I knew what I was doing was I was going to take away all of the excess things that I saw on every other website that manages domains and DNS, and I'm going to boil it down to the most minimal things that a lazy person would need to type in order to get something to happen, and that was the goal. And so I knew simple had to be in the name. DNSimple at the time was not available, and so I went out and I registered DNSimple and started building it from there. Years later, I did manage to acquire DNSimple and DNSimple.com and redirect that to the main domain. But frankly, it was enough to get going. This was in 2010, and so was that in a lot of the internet industries. The legacy players that had been in the industry for quite some time had grown big and had slowed down. They weren't really innovating much anymore. And a new crop of companies were starting to come up. This was also pre-Route 53, pre-Azure, pre-everything that the big players were doing. I started in April of 2010 and launched in July of 2010. And again, because the goal was always to be self-sufficient and profitable, and a lean team was part of it. And we operated for the first few years, just me and my brother, and then we bought one little company that brought on another person. He actually became our first hire, and he's still our CTO today, Simone Carletti. But he came on and joined in 2012, and then my brother left in 2014, but I wanted to keep things small, so I did need to hire a few people, especially on the operations side, since he had all that knowledge. But we went for many years just being, say, 5, 6, 7 people, and really slowly and intentionally only hiring when we had to. That was actually for a specific reason. It's because at my previous startup, we had bit off more than we could chew, and there was one point where we weren't able to pay a contractor. And it really struck me as something I never wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that if I was with somebody, I could pay them. I couldn't maybe keep them, but I could always pay them. If I committed to, I'm a big fan of when I make a commitment, I keep that commitment. And so everything was done pretty organically, from growth of the team, from growth of the business. It was all just happened naturally. Never really tried to force feed it with outside investment dollars. We've never taken any money outside because it just didn't make any sense for our business. And like you said, it's highly competitive. It has been, and it's even more so now with the bigger players like Amazon and Microsoft and Google involved. But there's still always room to carve out a niche. And so that's what I focused on. I'm going to carve out a niche for engineers, for developers. I'm going to focus on the communities that I know. At the time, it was Ruby, and then it grew into the Go community and into other engineering communities. And it's created a very successful business without the need to add on a big team. So today, we're 25 people, and it's a mix between independent contractors and full-time employees.
I guess every time you read headlines about Crunchbase, another unicorn raising this much and that much, did you have second thoughts about, what if we supercharged it?
Oh, yeah.
Became the big gorilla in the room and bought out everybody else?
Yeah, there's definitely a fear of missing out. There's that FOMO that happens when you don't raise money. There were several times along the way where I said, wow, I feel like we could do more if we had capital. But I keep remembering back to a conversation I had with somebody so at the time I was living out in Hawaii, and it was somebody that I respected very much in business out there. And I talked to him about this topic, and he said, look, if you have a proven way to take $1 and turn it into $5, then you should go out and raise money. If you've proven that you can say, I have a channel, a marketing channel or a sales channel, where if I put in $1, and obviously it's a relative amount, but if I put in I can 5x it or 10x it or whatever, then go out and raise money. But if you're building a product, if you're doing something where you don't have that reliable stream of growth, then there's no point in taking outside money. You only end up doing more harm than good, basically. And I think he was right. What do I have now? I have a profitable company where I can support a solid team that lets me live the lifestyle that I want and have time for myself and for my family. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had taken outside money and had commitments to return that money at some multiple. I don't have those commitments, which is great because I have the commitments to my customers and my team, and that's pretty much it.
Wow. And you also mentioned Hawaii in the passing, very casually there. Was that part of your lifestyle?
So it was funny. I have 4 kids, and 3 of them are triplets. They were born in 2001.
Whoa.
Yeah. And then I have a last one who's 17 now. So when the triplets were, I think, 2.5, 3 years old, I got an email on New Year's Eve from a guy out in Hawaii who told me this fantastic story about software that he had written and that the developer had basically encrypted and said, I'm not going to give it to you until you pay me money. And an extortion amount, like he was saying, no, I want a lot of money for this. So he's basically holding it ransom. And so this guy calls me and he's like, oh man, I really need help. And he had found me because I'm a surfer, and he had found my website. At the time, I had a website where I was talking about all the different surf spots along the coast of Florida, which is where I grew up. And I was saying, here's what each one does, here's what you can find there and stuff like that. You're a programmer writing Java, and this app he had was in Java, and you're a surfer. I'm out in Hawaii. You should come out here and see if we want to work together. I was like, okay, let's give it a shot. So I flew out there to see, and we decided, yeah, it'd be interesting to work together. And my wife amazingly said, okay, we have one chance to do this. We'll uproot our entire family, including triplets who are 3 years old, take them out to Hawaii and try to give it a chance. We did. And it was crazy. There were a lot of ups and downs. We were able to do a lot of really interesting things, but it also was a struggle often because we were so far from her family. And so she really worked hard to give the kids a good base, to make sure that they did well in school, to make sure they were taken care of. I was working on this startup.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't ready for that. Usually when people start with, so the story starts with an email when someone's talking about ransom and wants me to fly out thousands of miles away, it usually ends up with some kind of scam. For you, it ended up with a lifestyle in Hawaii. How long did you stay?
So the first time around, we stayed for 2 years, I think. Yeah, I think it was 2 years. And we moved back to the mainland for a little bit, and then we went back again another year to try to make it happen one last time. So I was out there for several years. And like I said, it was fantastic. It was a really great experience. It's also hugely challenging because you're just so remote from everything. To just landmass, you're talking 4 or 5 hours by plane, right? So you are truly remote. So it makes being an engineer and being social in that space pretty challenging, but it was enjoyable. It was really fun anyways. And I love Hawaii. Hawaii's a beautiful place. The people are wonderful. There's a lot of really interesting culture out there. We've been back several times for vacation, but never back to live there again. It's also really expensive. So we decided, well, we're not going to do that again for the moment.
And that's all happening before DNSimple.
Yes, exactly. This was all leading up to the creation of DNSimple. In 2010 was when I ended my last stay in Hawaii and was getting things going. And we left Hawaii at that point and moved to France afterwards for a while.
Okay. Is there a story about France as well?
Yeah. So my wife's family is French. My side's American. And so we've spent time between both countries and we love both. So we find it hard to decide which one we want to stay in. And so what we've done is we've worked to make it possible for our kids to get both cultures, to get both languages, and to be true dual citizens in both places, really understand each culture and to make what they want to do with that and make their lives better.
How do you do that? Asking for a friend, like schools-wise, everything-wise, it's all wired to be in one spot, at least the majority of the time.
It is.
How did you go around that?
So the fact that we always spoke both languages with the kids helped out, I think, when we needed to integrate back into France or into the US. And then we tried to aim it where it corresponded with changes in their school level. So we said, okay, we'll do middle school in France and high school in the United States, for example. We actually left Hawaii. One of the reasons we left, it was because they were reaching that age where they would have had to enter into sort of the middle school level. And at the time, there were some pretty rough issues out in Hawaii with drugs and violence and things like that in schools specifically. And we said, we're going to try something else. We don't really want to have the kids go through that. And that was one of the things that kind of pushed us to give the shot to go to France. And then we had a lot of help when we were over there to get them up to speed on the language. Their teachers at the schools were extremely supportive, took time out of their day to teach them, to get them up to speed on the language side. And then vice versa, when they came back to the US, the triplets came back and they had to reintegrate into the US. And there are certain ways that the US schooling system is different. For example, mathematics, where we push students in the US much harder on mathematics than in France and try to advance them into like college level mathematics in high school. And so we had tutors, we had people helping out to help them get up to speed. So a lot of it was just reaching out to get help from the people who were around us and then giving our kids a strong family at home where they knew they could come and tell us if something wasn't working and we'd work with them to make it better.
And hopefully you don't mind me asking, but the kids didn't mind you like dragging them back and forth? They must have left friends here and there and all of that. They didn't mind it at all?
I can't say they didn't mind it. I think they understood it and ultimately accept that it was a choice that gave them more opportunities, but they also made sacrifices to do it. We knew they were, and they knew it. But they still all seem to do okay. My oldest kids now are 24, and they seem to be all doing pretty well. They're living their lives in different places around the world, and they've I don't know how to say it. They just have landed fairly well. So I think ultimately, while it was a challenge at the time, it was a lot of work for them. It ended up working out okay for everybody involved.
All right, there we go. So if you guys listening, Daddy's proud.
Yes, very, of all my kids.
All right, so let's shift a little bit to the actual elephant in the room and the 3-letter acronym. Cornerstone of the internet, everything stops working when it doesn't work. Maybe a little bit misunderstood. Let's maybe start with a high-level, broad picture. What does the internet run on today in terms of the actual DNS servers?
So the operational side has really, I would say, 3 or 4 different layers in it. So at the most fundamental basic level, you have what's called the root servers. And these are a set of hundreds of servers that are delegated to lots of different organizations and companies. And they are run in what we call an anycast network design so that they are always available Even though you might have one address, there could be many physical machines behind that address. And so that's the fundamental core to the DNS system. If that fails, then everything else fails, right? So that has to be rock solid, which is why there are so many organizations involved in operating the root name servers. They're each operating a sort of a piece of it. They're geographically distributed. They are organizationally distributed. So for example, you have some that are for-profits, some that are non-profits, some that are educational institutions, some that are governmental. And so all of these different organizations coordinate to make those root servers work. Then above that, for every top-level domain, so .com, .net, .org, whatever you pick, right? .ceo, there's a whole bunch of them, right? .arrow. There's a organization that's called the registry. That organization runs the top-level domain name servers. So they have essentially the list that says, if you're looking for a name, so let's just say, for example, Anthony.com, or even actually the real one, Anthony.com, that's my domain. So you're looking for that. You have to go ask the .com name servers, where do I find that? And they then delegate to another set of name servers, which are the authoritative name servers. And so at DNSimple, that's what we run. So we run authoritative name servers for an actual second or third level domain. So Anthony.com is running on DNSimple's name servers. After asking the root, then asking the TLD, then asking our name server, you finally get back usually something. It could be another delegation to another set of name servers. That's the fundamental core idea behind DNS, is that it's this tree that branches out and that's fully distributed. The other party that's involved is what we call resolvers. So that means from my computer, when I type in a domain and I need to turn that into something, usually there's what we call a stub resolver running on your computer, which is going to go out and talk to a public or ISP resolver. So this is a resolver that is, all it's doing is basically doing recursive queries to the root, to the TLDs, to the authoritative name servers to do the lookup process. And so all these parts work together to convert, whenever you put a domain name in, into one or more IP addresses. And that's how it works on the operational side. So whenever I talk about DNS, I'm usually talking about it in terms of the operational side. Then there's this whole other side, which is when we talk about the registrars. And that's what I call the intellectual property side. So that's when you want to buy a domain name, or you want to renew a domain name, or transfer a domain name from one registrar to another. That's all related to intellectual property side. That's, I'm going to get this domain. And really at that point, all you're saying is I am the domain holder for a time period. I can renew it if I want to. I pay a fee each year to do this. And then I can go through that registrar to say, delegate the operational DNS to this authoritative name server. And so that's the kind of two pieces that I always like to think about. I like to think about the operational side and the intellectual property side. And DNSimple does both of those. Some providers will only do one, but many providers will do both as well. They'll do the operational and the intellectual property side.
Okay, so a few questions. First of all, the root servers. Who's actually paying the bills? Who's paying for the electricity they run on?
So the organizations that operate them are doing that themselves. They're doing that as a service to the global internet to ensure that it continues operating. There is an organization that oversees names and numbers. They're called, I believe it's International Corporation for the Assignment of Names and Numbers. And they call themselves a multi-stakeholder organization for the oversight on names and numbers of the internet. So that organization oversees the organizations that are running those root name servers, but every one of those root name servers is paid for completely and fully by the group that's operating them.
Okay, so it's not like government. I only know ICANN because there's like a fee on my bill every time I renew a domain. So now I'm learning more about that, but it's like across different countries, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, when we say multi-stakeholder, that's multinational stakeholders, and not just businesses in those countries. It's also nonprofits in those countries. It's government agencies in those countries. It is actually a fairly massive operation to have oversight, not just into the domain name side of it, but also the IP address side of it, which they cover as well. And they have some other organizations that are under their umbrella as well. And they're essentially, like, ICANN's job is to specify internet policy around names and numbers and to help ensure that internet policy is continuously kept up to date with the changes of the world. And they have in-person meetings multiple times a year. Sometimes it's technically oriented, sometimes it's policy oriented. So there's different reasons that they meet, but they organize regular meetings that bring in quite a lot of knowledgeable people from the space into different areas around the world. And since they really try to be global, they move those meetings around. So one year it might be in Asia, the next part of the year it might be in Europe, then it could be in Africa, it could be South America, it could be North America. It's constantly moving around. So it's extremely culturally diverse and extremely geared towards involving everyone in that, because the internet works because everybody's involved. If we were all trying to do our own thing, we wouldn't have an internet. We'd have a bunch of networks that wouldn't talk with each other.
But on the flip side to that, when everybody's involved, people try to exert like soft power.
Oh,
and I don't know if there's like an equivalent of, there's that phrase that they always use about gas closing the pipe. Is there equivalent of that on the DNS side as well?
So clearly larger organizations are going to have a little bit more weight in some of the decision-making processes, but most of the people that are involved in the operation of the internet at a low level, they're nerds. They care deeply about the internet as a whole. They may work for a company, but they have such a deep love and valuation of this thing that we have built that they really make decisions that are often better for everybody, even if it may mean more work for their organization. And that's actually one of the beautiful things about every time I go to one of these ICANN meetings, I've been to a few over the years, I'm always struck by how deeply the folks that are there care about the success of this thing that is the internet.
What you describe, it sounds a little bit like people working for this massive multinational science experiments, like the large particle collider, stuff like that. That's the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comparison. I think it's born out of the space of science and technology versus being born solely for commercial reasons, right? We have to acknowledge that the internet was born out of collaboration between universities and governments around the world. It wouldn't have happened if we weren't willing to do that collaboration. And if the early creators of these protocols that we use today weren't willing to go, I'm just going to write up this protocol and give it away. Had everything been done in a proprietary fashion, it would have been, you know what? It would have been AOL dial-up. Anybody who's old enough to remember that can appreciate how far we've come with the internet.
That's content for a TV series in alternative reality where the internet didn't evolve the way it did.
I think it'd be pretty interesting content there for somebody to come up with that.
Okay, but then tell me that a lot of people will just configure like the Google's 8888 as their DNS server. Is that really Google just being a good citizen, paying for the servers to provide DNS resolver for people? Or do they have some kind of, I don't want to say nefarious, but business case for that as well?
They definitely have a business case. So the first is that there's a massive amount of information that you get from how the internet is operating if you operate one of the larger public resolvers. It's almost like you have a weather map for the internet as a whole. And that is a very important thing to have if you're running a company that is an internet company. So the companies that have launched public resolvers and run them, while yes, they're offering them for free as a service, which by the way they're expensive to run. That's not a cheap thing to run at scale, because you have to imagine how much traffic is going through these things, and they're essentially giving that away. They recover some of that by the knowledge they gain about how the internet is operating at a given point in time, from a security perspective to a performance perspective to whatever it may be. And they can use that knowledge and apply it to their commercial benefit, for example, to improve their routing if they want to. So there are definitely upsides to them running a public resolver. And Google's not the only one. Cloudflare runs one as well. IBM runs one as well. So there are a few large organizations that run these public resolvers.
Yeah, and if they switched it off one day, that would be like an incident.
Yeah, absolutely. If a public resolver goes down,
off the sky. Yeah, exactly. It also makes me think of this massive companies now laying their own cables across the Atlantic, which is probably a different conversation, kind of adjacent to what we're discussing here. But is that like a similar kind of business case?
I think it's even more, and I think that type of infrastructure development for a company is even a stronger business case for them, because in almost all cases, they're using that infrastructure or selling it. So they use it to their need. And if they have excess capacity, they might sell that capacity for a while, but they're using it to improve their response times, to improve the routing of their own traffic with their backbones. And that actually is, I think it's a super interesting topic that if you can ever get like a core network engineer on who maybe has a background of working everything from routers back in the Cisco days and before, and to now what the companies like Cloudflare and Google are doing with their routing. I think it's fascinating, the kinds of things doing. But there's a commercial value from owning the pipes to send data through.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, well, let's start with a run. So the domain prices seem to be going up, not down. I don't know if I'm the only one noticing that. Talk me through the economics of a domain. If I go to DNSimple and I go and register mickeylikescookies.com or whatever the domain name is, where does the money go? And why is it going up instead of down with the economies of scale and everything?
So the reason it's going up is because it's allowed to go up. So a few years back, for quite a long time, .com was fixed. And other TLDs could go up and down. They didn't have the same pricing, but there was this acknowledgement that, hey, .com's so fundamental, it needs to be accessible to everybody, and not everybody can afford that like regular price updates. So for a long time, it was fixed. Then a few years back, they got approval to regularly increase each year the price by some percentage point. I think it was like 5 to 8% or something like that year over year. And so they've done that. It's just that, look, we're going to do this because there's operational costs. So we talked about the operation of the core infrastructure and all the services that go around that the registrars use through the registry. There's a lot of, they say, the costs are going up for us, so we need to have a built-in way to do this, to raise prices steadily. In terms of how the money is divvied up, a good portion of that money goes straight to the registry. So let's say I'm selling a .com domain for $15. I think at this point, something like, I can't remember the latest, but I think it's close to $9 of that goes to the registry. The registry being, in this case, the VeriSign, because they operate the .com top-level domain. A small portion goes to ICANN. So you talked about the ICANN fee that you see in there. That's to help ICANN's operational cost. Then a portion goes to the registrar. So if a registrar is selling directly, then the remainder goes to the registrar. However, a lot of registrars don't necessarily sell all domains directly by contacting the registry. They create reseller agreements with other registrars who might be better at certain TLDs or have access to certain TLDs. And so then the registrar will keep an additional small portion of that, and then the remainder will go to the reseller. And so there's a fairly complicated supply chain of who's involved to get that domain from your idea, and it's available, out to actually being registered and deployed.
And there's, on top of that, this entire alternative economy, right? That is reselling domains that already exist, right? They can go for millions of dollars potentially. Is that an interesting business to be in?
The domain aftermarket industry, I've never been a huge fan of it myself. I know there are people who have made a lot of money off of it. A lot of money, like multi-millionaire folks that all they did was buy and sell domains. They were there at the right time. They were there early in the game, like in any other kind of investor, right? They treated domain names like it was property.
Scarce resource.
There is clearly a business there. It's not one that I've ever been particularly involved in. I know that there are still folks who basically what they do is they will look for expiring domains that have traffic because there are ways that you can tell that a particular domain has traffic. And then they will buy those, whatever the auction price is, essentially. They're going to try to get it either when it expires or they're going to try to buy it from the organization that's holding it, whatever it might be at the tail end when the domain's about to expire. And then they will try to put things on that page to take that traffic. It might be, for example, around a particular set of keywords, and then use that to arbitrage so that is sent to a higher value site that then pays them back, and they basically try to work on the margins there. So there are people that do that. There are other folks that buy domains and then try to develop them into internet properties. I think there's less and less of that these days. The expansion of TLDs killed that as a business model. There's a lot of ways to talk about cookies on the internet with a lot of different types of domains now. So you don't need the .com version of it. But if you own cookies.com, that's a pretty high value property, and you may want to develop it into a site where people can get all of their favorite cookies from one place.
There you go. And despite all this, now I don't know how many extensions there are, hundreds, right?
Thousands.
Maybe thousands. But is .com still king?
Yeah.
Does it still mean that the other ones are not nearly as valuable?
Yes, absolutely. I think close to 200 million .com domains registered, if not over that at this point. And that dwarfs the next nearest neighbor. So it is still the king of the hill. If you are trying to build a leading property on the internet, you can start with something else, but ultimately you're probably going to end up wanting to get the .com because it still has extra weight in search engines. It still has extra weight in people's minds. It still is the thing that people talk about when they talk about domain names.
So you mentioned the auction price. So does it mean that people who hold like thousands and thousands of these domains, they don't pay the full price, or they have to at least pay the $9? Sorry, you said $9 for .com that goes to the registrar.
It could be that for .com. There's still if you have a domain name that's registered, every year you're going to pay some sort of renewal fee. Even those folks that have portfolios that have hundreds of thousands of domains in them, they're paying those fees. Rating that if a small number of those are either successfully converted into a that has traffic or sold off to somebody else for a much higher dollar amount.
Got it. Yeah, the reason I don't know about that, because obviously a younger me had the domain expire, and then someone shoot me an email saying, hey, do you want this for thousands of dollars? And I was like, no, I don't have thousands of dollars. So I guess this is still going on.
Yes, it does. Right. Absolutely.
Okay. Personal question. As someone who's worked with DNS for such a long time, are you free of this habit of having a bright idea under the shower, then going registering the domain name that goes with it, then not doing anything with it for a couple of years, and eventually giving up on it and letting someone else pick it up for you? Are you immune to that?
I wish I could say yes, but no. No, I still have a lot of domains, silly domains, things that I thought I'd do over the years, and I just can't part with them. It's a habit, and I don't do it as much anymore. I don't go register domains as much anymore, but I can't get rid of the ones that I have registered that never turned anything, because I think, but someday that idea is going to come to life. I don't know. It's a weird thing, isn't it?
It's such a nerd thing too. Like, other people don't understand. They're just, what, you're paying for that? What? Every year? But no, I can relate to that. Okay. All right. Great. You know what you mean to actually makes me feel a little bit better about myself. Okay. Let's say that I go to DNS. And by the way, sorry, I was going to say DNSimple again. DNSimple. The fee structure seems to be different. When I go to Namecheap or whatever, GoDaddy, I just pay a flat fee. You guys have slightly more complicated fee structure, right? Why is that?
From the beginning, when I created DNSimple, it was going to be a DNS company, not a domain registrar. That was always the plan. That's always been the fundamental difference between what we do and what like a Namecheap does, right? So most domain registrars, they start with domain registration and they give away DNS for free. They give away other things for free. But they have to grow and offer other services because domain names, frankly, aren't great in terms of margins. As I mentioned, we talked about the fee structure, and we're talking about I'm selling a .com for $15, but imagine somebody like a Namecheap that is either selling it almost at cost or even using it as a loss leader. They need to recuperate that money through other services. So they branch off into web hosting, and they branch off into website builders, and they branch off into email hosting, and so on and so forth. And with DNSimple, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be a company that did a bunch of different things. I wanted to be a company that did one thing really well. And Simple, it was built around this idea that we're a service provider. We're providing you really good authoritative DNS. And that's how we're going to structure how you work with DNSimple. So you have to create a subscription first before you register a domain. Even if that subscription, at least in our current pricing, is you don't pay anything until you actually get that first domain and start using it. There's still, you put in your payment details up front. We make sure that's clear that we are a company that's going to be there with you for the long haul. We're not a company where you buy a domain and then you're like, oh, I don't care about them very much. We want to build a relationship with our customers. So the pricing model, the onboarding model, the sales model, all of it is organized around the operational side of DNS first. And domain registrations is something that you can do at DNSimple, but we're not necessarily the best to do it. We're not going to offer you all these tools for finding your best domain, because most of the people that come to us, they know the domain they want, or they already own it and they really want to operate it. And that's the area that we think is our sweet spot.
I like that. It reminds me of Honest Burger. I don't know if that exists in the US, the chain, but doing one thing and being upfront about the prices and not charging extra for pickles. Jesus Christ. Why do people do that?
I think that's that's Five Guys here, right? Five Guys in the US. You can get all the toppings you want on it and they don't charge you extra for it. And even things like grilled mushrooms and grilled onions. Pretty fantastic.
Crazy. Wow. What a business model. All right. So I've got a few random things at the back of my head that I really want to make sure I ask you. Is there like a Linux of the DNS servers? Is there like a code base that like operates a majority of them, or is it spread out across different implementations?
So historically, Bind has been the de facto implementation. Bind 8 is the current version that's running on a lot of software or a lot of systems out there. And that's because the Bind was created by some of the original folks who created the specifications, the RFCs, for how DNS was going to work. So it was the reference implementation, even though there was really never a reference implementation. We've successfully used Power DNS over the years as well, and still use it for some of our components today. And a lot of that is because it doesn't have to be the reference implementation. So it can optimize in areas and leave out things that Bind can't leave out, because Bind is the reference implementation. And so I think those are the two big ones in terms of the authoritative side. There's also Unbound, which is another one. I think that's from NL Labs. So there's a lot of different ones. And then you have lots of different implementations across different languages for different purposes. There are a plethora of open source DNS servers out there that you can learn from, all of them which have their own little ups and downs and gotchas that are fun to find and try to fix.
Speaking of which, so which RFC is that, the DNS standard?
The original ones were 1034 and 1035. Technically, it goes back to an 800 one, but the ones that we all follow, when you start thinking, I want to think about the domain name system and the definition of it, the two core ones are 1034 and 1035. But that's just the beginning. Basically, you start peeling back that onion and oh my goodness, there are a ton of RFCs. So much so that people have websites where it catalog all the DNS RFCs.
So is Bind still implementing, what's the word even, like the official parts of that?
Yeah, I think Bind still considers itself to be the reference implementation. I think this new RFCs come out. The folks who maintain Bind strive to use Bind as an example of how to implement that particular RFC. So it's written in C. It's really well known. It's well tested, and it's used in so many places that if there's going to be a defect that occurs, it's going to be in Bind. If there's a problem, somebody will find it in the Bind implementation somewhere and they'll work to fix it.
And like, obviously I have in my head like the OG people who put up the early standards, but these days, is it all coming from like large companies coming and saying, hey, let's suggest this is going to save us a bunch of money? Or are there still the nerds suggesting improvements to the standard?
Oh, there's still a lot of folks that aren't even at a big company. They're at nonprofits. They're at educational institutions. There's a lot of nerds out there that are still really into iteratively improving the DNS protocol through new RFCs. And it's a collaborative effort. Very few RFCs come from one person in one organization. They almost always involve at least two organizations who collaborate on it, because it's harder to get consensus. So there's an organization called the IETF, and they're the ones that are responsible for the development and promotion of RFCs for public consumption. And they have a very clear process on how to take something from an idea to an RFC that needs buy-off from multiple parties. You don't just do it because you feel like doing it. You do it because the community agrees that this is something that will be good overall for the operation of the internet. And DNS isn't the only protocol, obviously, that works like that. A lot of your listeners probably follow what's happening with HTTP. If they're geeking out on the web, like HTTP is another example of a protocol that has evolved over time through lots of parties from browser makers to server-side implementers to just protocol geeks who work hard to make sure that they try to do the best for the entirety of the community, not just one organization.
And for DNS, where does it actually happen? Is there a mailing list like Linux style? Where does one go to try to follow that craziness?
So there's as I mentioned, the IETF, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force. They're a standards organization that just does this. What they do is they help get changes made to protocols through the RFCs. And if you go to ietf.org, you can go and you can see everything that's happening right now. They usually structure it by having working groups that break off to work on some area, whether it's security, whether it's low-level networking protocols, whatever it might be. And those working groups will produce these RFCs and shepherd them through their development. So that, to me, is the place that you go if you want to get deep down into the weeds of what's happening in standards.
Got it. What is the most outrageously annoying thing about DNS? Like the thing that your wife just can't listen about, and like the thing that, and if you had a magic wand and could go back in time and...
Oof. I doubt, as I'm not smart enough to profess having an ability to fix any of the bad sides of DNS, so I'm not going to go there. I would say that the thing that is the hardest thing to deal with is the scale at which it has to operate and the scale at which people attack it. Like that's the most frustrating thing as an operator of DNS, as somebody who's watched the calls and the implementations grow over time. The size of the attacks that can hit at DNS are really sometimes hard to even fathom to deal with. And I think that's, from an operator standpoint, one of the hardest things, and the things that if I could fix that, I would. I have no idea how. I don't think it's fixable. On the other side of it, I would say the thing that bothers me the most as somebody who wants to see the internet do well is when people just undervalue it. Like, my DNS, it's running on a server somewhere. And like Bob down in IT handles our DNS. And then they're shocked when a domain expires and their entire software goes down and like, where's Bob? And somebody says, Bob hasn't worked here in 4 years. And okay, cool. Where's our domain? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the credentials are to log into Registrar X. That's some fly-by-night provider out there. And that, to me, is something that every time I just want to slap the head and go, come on. We have ways to do better. You have tools like ours at DNSimple where somebody can have multiple users with different levels of privilege, their own credentials, multi-factor authentication. Why are you still sharing one password that Bob has written on that Bob has written on a sticky somewhere on his computer? Really? Come on. For me, that's a frustrating thing that we talk about regularly.
Gee, that and the certificates, right?
Same deal. Let's Encrypt. Kudos to them. They did a massive to the internet by specifying a few things about how it was going to work. They're giving it away for free. They're requiring rotation every 90 days. And they're making everything automated from validation to deployment. That, and having a standard protocol as the way to communicate, that has changed so much about how we do certificates. There's still a lot of companies and organizations that haven't caught up, but we will get there one day. And it's something we've been a supporter of theirs since the earliest days. Every year we send money, we support it because we believe foundationally for the internet, having something like that has been such a benefit to the internet as a whole.
Who's behind Let's Encrypt? Is that a nonprofit?
Yes, it's a nonprofit. I'm trying to remember. It is definitely a nonprofit. They are a service provided by the Internet Security Research Group, ISRG. And yes, they operate as a nonprofit.
Okay, I guess to this kind of acronyms, it gets a little mysterious, mystical even.
And everything we do is just so laden with acronyms in our space. It's ridiculous.
But yeah, I can definitely relate to Bob. Working infrastructure, Jesus Christ. Nobody cares as long as it works. And then when it stops, that's when everybody does.
Yeah, yeah. And unfortunately, usually when it stops pretty brutally. Like something goes down and it goes down hard. There's this one single point of failure that's a router somewhere, and that router just got unplugged. And our entire network is gone. So the internet has gotten better as a whole in operating when it comes to the way we structure and design our hardware systems. But we're also losing that knowledge as we delegate it out to a smaller and smaller number of big providers. It's one of the things that's always made me a little concerned about some of the directions we've chosen by putting all of our eggs in the giant company baskets, is that they now have that knowledge internally, and ideally they're sharing that knowledge, and some of them will, but there's still something about being able to get your hands on operating switches and routers and networking equipment and servers that if we're not careful, we will lose as a whole. Like the majority of people won't even know that exists down below. They'll think that everything is just on demand. And I do worry a little for the longevity of the internet in an environment where such a small number of organizations operate so much of it, which is, again, why I really like the way that ICANN has structured the multi-stakeholder system, where you don't have just one organization that runs all of this.
For sure. Do you feel like DNS has had a little bit of renaissance lately with Kubernetes, and all of a sudden people needing to understand DNS again and needing to operate potentially clusters with that, like all this made up IPs for pods and stuff like that, and all of a sudden debugging, what was it, core DNS and stuff like that? Did you notice that?
It's hard for me to notice that because I've been in it the entire time. I've never really left it.
Yeah, you're too deep.
Yeah, exactly. I've gone too deep down the rabbit hole. There's no escape for me. I definitely think there was window that we still probably haven't left where DNS was used as a routing protocol again internally. So it's an ebb and flow. Sometimes it comes up and people want to use DNS internally to route things, and then sometimes it goes down and they say, no, we don't want to use DNS and naming as a way to route this. We're going to use some other mechanism like encrypted keys or what have you as determined routing. So I think it's an ebb and flow. And we did go up on that for a little bit with things like Kubernetes with the console from HashiCorp. Like the tooling was moving that direction. Will it stay there? I have no idea, because it does have its issues running at scale when you're dealing with a proliferation of DNS as the sole way of routing internally in your network.
Anthony, a real treat to talk to you. For anybody who wants to follow you and what you're doing, you mentioned anthonyeden.com, not to confuse with anthony.com, which seems to be skincare. Where else do people follow you and DNSimple?
So they can find me on LinkedIn. I do posts there. I talk a little bit about DNSimple there. And then, of course, they can always reach out to me at DNSimple. I'm anthony.eden@dnsimple.com. I do ask that if you reach out to me, don't try to sell me things. I'm a big proponent of not spamming people. And if you try to sell me something and we don't have any connection, I will probably mark you as spam, because I'm a graybeard and I get to say, get off my lawn while I yell at the cloud. But I'm happy if people have questions, if they're genuinely interested in the kinds of work that we do, if they have serious and honest questions about how the internet works, especially around DNS, I'm always happy to entertain conversations with that. So yeah, they can reach out to me directly via email, hit me up on LinkedIn. Pretty easy to find there.
There you go. You have been warned.
Yes, they have been warned. I am very quick to click the spam button if I get unsolicited email.
Thank you so much. I certainly learned quite a bit, and I hope that a lot of people did too.
Thank you for having me on, Miko. I really appreciate it.